Well, hey guys, my name is Derek, and I am excited to present for our team. Before we get going, let me say just a couple of quick thoughts. Number one, huge thank you to Jennifer and the rest of our team. Although I get the privilege of being the presenter, Jennifer really carried a lot of the weights and organized a lot of things along with the rest of our team. And so I get the privilege of presenting, but really is a team effort on this. And I'm excited to present for us Machiavelli and his work, The Prince. Machiavelli is an interesting figure as you look through sources in history, almost polarizing, which just seems to be the tendency in these historical figures. And so such titles have been applied to Machiavelli as the founder of modern political science, the first liberal, but then other things such as the devil's apostle. Machiavelli his work differed from others in his time. He is incredibly synonymous with political ethics, and the terms Machiavellianism or Machiavellian are obviously from his namesake, and they're used to describe political leaders who are deceitful, manipulative, who might use power and the political game to make moves for their own greater sake. And so he's kind of this interesting, fascinating character that stands out in history in a unique time. And so here is our hope for this presentation, is that we're going to look at the historical context or the historical playground that Machiavelli operated in and that which produced his great work, The Prince. And then we're going to kind of use that to analyze his leadership style and sort of look at the significance of how that's played out in our own leadership theories to this day. And so let's begin by looking at the historical context of Machiavelli. Machiavelli was born in 1469 in Florence, Italy, during a time where there was an incredible amount of turmoil, struggle, and weight in the political sphere of things. And so in enters the brilliant mind of Machiavelli. He had a formal education at a very young age, and he attended the University of Florence. As was common in Machiavelli's time period, he studied the works of Aristotle, Plato, and other philosophers and ethical theorists. And so Machiavelli kind of enters the scene in a big way in the year of 1494 in Florence, when the current ruling family, the Medici family, was overthrown and their family is out and a republic is set up. And the person who's going to be appointed the second chancellor of the Republic of Florence is none other than our person of Machiavelli 4 short years later in the year of 1498. And so he serves until 1512 when, interestingly enough, the Medici family that was overthrown years earlier kind of comes back in and retakes over power of Florence, Italy. And so Machiavelli is cast out, and kind of interesting with that is that Machiavelli was in charge of the military, and so there was just kind of this direct opposition, and so Machiavelli finds himself cast out and exiled and even tortured for a short period of time, and finally they kind of just say, we're not going to kill you, you're going to be exiled to this small community outside of Florence. And through years of serving as the chancellor, watching the political stage in what was the hub of Italy, Machiavelli will begin to pen his work, The Prince. Now, in talking about The Prince, here's where we're going to kind of begin for that. The Prince was written in 1513. So just shortly after all this stuff goes down in Florence, Machiavelli decides to write The Prince. And The Prince, kind of, if we were to just summarize this book, is what Machiavelli sees as effective and efficient ways that a ruler ought to lead, or what a ruler should look like. The reason that some people have called him the devil's apostle is because in the time that Machiavelli wrote his book, The Prince, what people thought was a good leader was one who was virtuous, always did good, always did right. And so in enters this kind of left field writing by Machiavelli that says, well, I'm not going to talk directly about God. I'm not even going to talk directly about moral law or moral virtue. I'm not going to talk about the fact that a ruler ought to have a higher power to answer to. I'm going to talk brass tacks about princes, rulers, and principalities. And so this would have been immensely difficult context to meld into in this kind of religiously dominated time period. And this is the culture in which Machiavelli writes The Prince. He argues that one must look at realism as opposed to idealism, that idealism is what has got them into this political stage and political mess. And so this work is kind of this reflection from a real life experience of ascending to power, being overthrown in power, of what a real, effective leader would do. Machiavelli believes that men are naturally evil, but that with wise stewardship, you can win their affection. Machiavelli is interesting in that although he does not necessarily believe that goodness and all these things must be strived for, he does arrive at a conclusion that a good leader is often one who is kind to his servants or to his vassals, but at the same time recognizes this need for shrewdness. Machiavelli seems to err on the side of a kinder leader in spite of his thoughts on morality and goodness, but at the same time that there should be a certain sort of shrewdness to that leadership style. And one of his infamous lines from The Prince is that it would be best to be both loved and feared. But since the two rarely come together, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved. Machiavelli's point of view was that a ruler should do well to have the affections of his people, to have the trust and even love of his people. But where Machiavelli differs from many popular thinkers of his time is that if you need to exterminate a population, if you need to slam down the fist of power, then you need to do so in order to maintain control. According to Machiavelli, the ruler strikes fear into his people because people are naturally evil and going to bend towards these wicked things. And even if they love him, at some point they're going to turn against this ruler or this prince. And so by having a mixture of both fear and of love, Machiavelli kind of steps into this interesting new space and place where the people both fear him but love him. And so the love keeps them loyal, and when loyalty fails, the fear keeps them from revolt. Here's what he says: love is a bond of obligation which these miserable creatures break whenever it suits them to do so. But fear holds them fast by a dread of punishment that never passes. So one of Machiavelli's main points in The Prince were that the actions of the ruler should be guided by keeping his power and keeping control of his land. Kellerman states that there's no avoiding the unavoidable. The prince should do what he must, from being good to being bad, even to the point, if necessary, of being brutal. And so in The Prince, the theme that we see kind of teased out is not virtue for the sake of virtue or ethics for the sake of ethics, but that the motives behind a prince's action ought to be self-serving. And that by this self-serving, the greater good, we might say, of keeping their land and keeping their power will be held. And so that at times, what may appear beneficial to the general population or the people at play is in fact a ruler doing what he must and what he ought to. And so this kind of throws a bomb into the middle of popular thought, and Machiavelli is sort of just saying it how it is. Do what you need to do and keep your control and keep your power. And so though the motives behind this may come across as selfish, Machiavelli does still have this genuine argument threaded in that selfishness often best teases its way out in kindness to the people, only showing cruelty in order to maintain power and order. And so with that said, let's kind of look at how this applies to leadership style and into leadership theory. Our team would argue that Machiavelli's leadership style falls underneath the great man theory talked about in our text. Great evidence from this comes from several passages that I'll read about Machiavelli, that the great man is that who, by valorous ways, become princes. Like these men, acquire a principality with difficulty, but they keep it with ease. The difficulties they have in acquiring it rise in part from the new rules and methods which they are forced to introduce to establish their government and its security. What Machiavelli is saying there, translated, is the ruler rose because he was able to do something that had not yet been done. This is the great man theory at play, I believe, that this great man must step into the picture in order to climb, and the climb will be difficult, but the plateau will be great, and that is what takes a great man. Here's a different argument that Machiavelli presents. He notes that those who easily take the reins in leadership, whether through birth order or a terrible series of political events, might take the reins easier, or to use our analogy, might climb the mountain simply, but upon being there, they have no chops. They weren't special after all. They weren't these great men. The theory does not rest upon them, and so they're unable to keep it. Thus, the weak man does not thrive in a culture that seeks a great leader. And so what Machiavelli is saying is that to be the prince, you must be great. The great man theory can often seem cruel in our own present day because of the power that rests on the hands of the few. I mean, even just a couple minutes ago, we said that selfishness is kind of what needs to drive this great man. Yet Machiavelli recommends that the leader should desire to be considered clement and not cruel. Nevertheless, he ought to take care not to misuse this clemency. So what Machiavelli is sort of representing is that this great man must rise to power and with kindness and clemency maintain this power, and it takes a special person to do that. And so through Machiavelli's work of the prince, we kind of zoom in on this one ruler society, and he even pens many more works, one being the Discourses on Livy and the other, The Art of War. And so we believe that Machiavelli kind of stands out as this picture of the great man theory, and with that, we're going to kind of talk about some of his other works. By beginning, we'll talk about the Discourses on Livy, which is this kind of extensive, in-depth work that spans several books. And here's kind of the overview of that. The first book concerns the proper structuring of a republic. It's going to discuss warfare and how republics ought to function in warfare. And then kind of again teasing out this great man theory is going to pull out the idea of individualized leadership as important in the republic. The second book in this series is going to talk about the growth of the Roman Empire, which Machiavelli believes was sort of the flourishing of the Roman political order. He kind of has this just fascination with them. And essentially, from that, Machiavelli is sort of painted to be a type of imperialist who believes that conquest and government is required by many social conventions and wiring of mankind in order to protect a republic's integrity. And then he kind of wraps that up in book 3 by giving examples of great men. There's that theory again of great men in the Roman Empire, and persuades them that virtuous and great leaders and these standout figures, your star athletes, your 5-star recruits, have incredible, important, immense value and crucial functioning in a flourishing society. And so these particular people not only govern, but they also have the ability to motivate other people to do great works. I would love to explore more of the idea that great men could produce great men as something that is spun off of Machiavelli's initial theories, but he can produce great citizens, great warriors, great thinkers, great politicians, and being able to do this and continue this cycle of leadership continues to create great people, which goes back to the original sort of thoughts and theories of Machiavelli, is that this is what keeps a republic flourishing. His second work is The Art of War. Don't tell Sun Tzu this, but he has a book called The Art of War, and this is a 16th century kind of guidebook, handbook, discourse on how a 16th century army ought to act and perform when they are going to deploy and engage in battle. And it's kind of this book that's written as a dialogue between a speaker representing Machiavelli and this other guy who's at play, and he's sort of just affirming and going, hey, tell me more, and in this wisdom is sort of leaked out from this Machiavelli character that gives sort of a handbook towards how war functions. Let me kind of give some other important information as we wrap up. In this time is the Reformation and sort of discontent with the Catholic Church, and Anabaptists are beginning to kind of cause fear all around, and things are changing. Religious orders are shifting. The Judeo-ethic for the first time in hundreds of years is sort of on a shaky foundation. There's this great divide between Catholics and Protestants, which draws lines between towns, which draws lines between nations, and so this is kind of the playing field that Machiavelli is boxing out his own opinions and thoughts in. Fast forward several hundred years, and great Americans like John Adams even state that they were heavily influenced by Machiavelli and just the good of his writing. And so Machiavelli kind of has this mixture of, he causes strife and turmoil, and later on he's going to kind of have this tremendous upswing and tremendous upside, and that's often how many of these characters were in shaking things up. And so let me conclude with several thoughts to sum up our time together, and that'll wrap it up for me. It is argued by some that the idea the end justifies the mean can be attributed to the works of Machiavelli. In The Prince, Machiavelli advocates that rulers have to do what must be done, even if at the time that may seem morally wrong. It has a greater good or greater purpose to it, so the ends justify the means could be a concept or thought teased out from Machiavelli. Though some people have previously twisted or distorted what Machiavelli meant, he did indeed argue that a leader should gain favor. He's not giving permission to cruel, hateful leadership, and only acting truly harshly in order to maintain power and order. His receiving of education in great thinkers, in the classics, greatly influenced his writing, and he kind of stands out in history as one of these characters who is able to synthesize the works of history and his context in order to push society forward in new ideas. And because he was not just a thinker but actually a doer, as he was the second chancellor and all these things, he's able to put these things into practice. And that he is also definitely a case of someone who was not greatly appreciated in his time. Almost kind of reminds me of some of the authors you hear about who become famous after they're dead and their works kind of take off. The Great Gatsby plays into mind. That's kind of how Machiavelli is. The Prince and the Livy discourses were published after his death, but obviously he lives on. He kind of stands out as this man who championed the great man leadership theory, and we are certainly today impacted by the works of Machiavelli, specifically his great work, The Prince, the work he did on the great man theory, the time he surrounded himself in, and that is how we would present this information to you guys. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen.